The Wehrmacht sniper adjusted his scope on a ridge overlooking the British positions near Arras in May 1940. Through his Zillenrohr, he watched enemy marksmen settling into defensive positions, and what he saw made him laugh. The British were carrying rifles that looked like they belonged in his grandfather's attic. Long, awkward things with chunky wooden stocks and iron sights that seemed positively medieval compared to his sleek carabiner 98k. German intelligence reports filtering back to divisional headquarters carried the same dismissive tone. British sniper units were equipped with Pattern 14 rifles, a design that predated the Great War. 30-year-old technology. The running joke amongst German marksmen was that Churchill must have raided museum collections to arm his forces. Then the shooting started and the joke stopped rather abruptly. The first indication something was wrong came during the Dunkirk perimeter defense. German sniper teams, confident in their modern equipment and training, found themselves consistently outshot at ranges beyond 600 yards. British marksmen were landing killing shots at distances where German snipers struggled to even locate their targets. A Grief writer named Klaus Becker, part of the 6th Army's sniper detachment, recorded in his diary that he'd been forced to withdraw after a British sniper put 3 rounds within inches of his position from what he estimated was nearly 800 meters. He'd never seen the shooter, never heard the report clearly enough to locate him, and the precision at that distance seemed impossible for what he'd been told was obsolete equipment. By June 1940, Wehrmacht intelligence officers were filing reports that couldn't be ignored. British sniper effectiveness wasn't just good, it was statistically anomalous. German units were losing officers and machine gun crews to single, precisely placed shots from ranges that shouldn't have been practical for infantry rifles. The Pattern 14, dismissed as a relic, was consistently achieving what German ordnance experts considered near impossible accuracy for a service rifle. One report from 7th Panzer Division noted that British snipers were regularly engaging targets at ranges where German return fire was essentially guesswork. The turning point in German perception came in late June when a captured British sniper position near Abbeville yielded an intact Pattern 14 rifle with its ammunition. The weapon was immediately sent to Wehrmacht testing facilities where ordnance officers expected to quickly identify why the British were clinging to such an antiquated design. What they found instead was deeply unsettling. The rifle wasn't obsolete through poor performance. It had been superseded by the Lee-Enfield for entirely different reasons. When German testers fired the P-14 at their standard range targets, the groupings were tighter than their own Kar98k could achieve. At 1,000 alum, the difference wasn't marginal. It was substantial and repeatable. German intelligence summaries from July 1940 show a marked shift in tone. The Pattern 14 was reclassified from obsolete equipment to specialized precision rifle of significant tactical concern. Wehrmacht training documents began warning sniper teams that British marksmen outranged them and advising extreme caution when engaging at distances beyond 500 meters. The rifle, that had been mocked as a museum piece just weeks earlier, was now forcing German tactical doctrine to adapt. Officers who'd laughed at intelligence reports of 30-year-old rifles were now reading casualty lists that told a rather different story. The British weren't using antiques because they lacked modern equipment. They were using them because for the specific task of precision shooting at extreme range, nothing in anyone's current arsenal performed better. The story of how Britain came to possess this accidentally brilliant rifle begins not with triumph, but with embarrassment. In 1913, British military observers returned from studying continental armies with deeply troubling reports. The German GA-98 and its derivatives were demonstrably superior to the short magazine Lee-Enfield in one critical area: accuracy at extended range. During comparative trials, Mauser pattern rifles consistently outshot the Lee-Enfield beyond 600 YD. The reason was fundamental to the rifle's operating systems. The Lee-Enfield used a on-closing bolt action where the firing pin spring compressed as the bolt closed. This system allowed rapid fire. Trained soldiers could achieve 20 to 30 aimed rounds per minute. However, the design inherently introduced slight variations in lock-up consistency affecting precision at long range. The War Office made a decision that shocked traditionalists. They would abandon the Lee system entirely and adopt Mauser principles for a new rifle. The project, designated Pattern 13, began in earnest at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield. Chief designer Samuel Horace Leesy produced something quite radical. A rifle that incorporated the Mausers on opening action, where the firing pin spring compressed as the bolt opened. This seemingly minor change meant the bolt locked with consistent force every time, improving shot-o-shot accuracy. Leslie also specified a longer barrel, 26, and compared to the Lee-Enfield's 25, and a completely new cartridge, the 276 Enfield, designed to match German ballistic performance. The prototypes performed brilliantly. Testing at high in late 1913 showed the Pattern 13 achieving groupings at 1,000 yards that the Lee-Enfield simply couldn't match. The rifle's aperture rear sight, inspired by American target rifles, proved far more precise than the Lee-Enfield's open notch. The stronger Mauser-type action could handle higher chamber pressures, and the rifle's overall construction was notably more rigid. By early 1914, the War Office had approved the design, now designated Pattern 14, for service adoption. Factories began tooling for production, and training manuals were drafted for the new weapon system. Then came August 1914, and everything changed. War erupted across Europe with stunning speed, and Britain needed rifles immediately. Not in 2 years, when factories could retool and ammunition stockpiles could be built. The Lee-Enfield, despite its accuracy limitations, was available in enormous quantities, and the entire British military infrastructure was built around it. Introducing a new caliber whilst fighting a continental war was logistical insanity. The Pattern 14 project faced an impossible situation. Britain needed millions of rifles but couldn't halt Lee-Enfield production to manufacture an untested replacement. The solution was born of desperation. In 1915, the British government contracted 3 American firms, Winchester, Remington, and Edone, to manufacture Pattern 14 rifles. However, the rifles would be converted to fire the standard 303 British cartridge rather than the original 276 Enfield. This eliminated the ammunition nightmare, whilst allowing production separate from British factories that were churning out Lee-Enfields at maximum capacity. American production began ramping up through 1916, but by then the Lee-Enfield was firmly established as the British service rifle. The P14 became something unexpected, a superior design relegated to secondary status by circumstance rather than performance. Over 1 million Pattern 14 rifles were produced in American factories between 1915 and 1917, yet they were issued primarily to reserve units, training establishments, and colonial forces. The rifle that was meant to replace the Lee-Enfield had instead become its overlooked cousin, sitting in armories, whilst the supposedly inferior design won the war. The War Office faced a paradox that would haunt military procurement decisions for decades. They possessed a rifle demonstrably more accurate than their service weapon, yet couldn't adopt it. The reasons extended far beyond the ammunition question. British infantry doctrine had evolved around the Lee-Enfield's extraordinary rate of fire. At the Battle of Mons in August 1914, German forces had reported facing machine gun fire when in fact they were experiencing the famous mad-minute-trained British riflemen firing 15 aimed rounds in 60 seconds. The Pattern 14, with its slower cock-on opening bolt, couldn't match that speed. A competent soldier might achieve 10 rounds per minute with the P14 versus 20 or more with the Lee-Enfield. This rate of fire disadvantage mattered enormously in the tactical context of the Western Front. British doctrine emphasized volume of accurate fire at ranges between 300 and 600 yards, distances where both rifles performed adequately. The P14's superiority only manifested clearly beyond 700 yards, ranges at which infantry engagements were relatively rare in the trench warfare that dominated from late 1914 onwards. Staff officers reviewing performance data reached a pragmatic conclusion. The Lee-Enfield was good enough for 95% of infantry work, and its rapid-fire capability made it superior for the close-range, high-intensity combat that characterized most engagements. There was also the human factor that procurement statistics couldn't capture. By 1916, the British Army had millions of men trained on the Lee-Enfield. They knew its quirks, its handling characteristics, its maintenance requirements. The rifle had proven reliable in mud, sand, and every miserable condition the war presented. Soldiers trusted it. Switching to the P14 meant retraining entire divisions on different manual of arms, different sight pictures, different muscle memory for bolt manipulation. During total war, this represented an impossible disruption. The Pattern 14 therefore occupied a strange middle ground through the Great War's final years. The American-manufactured rifles arrived in Britain throughout 1916 and 1917, and they were issued, but selectively. Reserve battalions received them, training camps used them, some colonial units carried them. They saw genuine combat service on various fronts, and soldiers who used them often praised the accuracy. Yet they never displaced the Lee-Enfield as the primary British infantry rifle. When American forces entered the war in 1917, many P14s were even rechambered to American 3006 caliber, becoming the U.S. rifle model of 1917 and served American doughboys in France. After the armistice in November 1918, the Pattern 14's fate seemed sealed. The rifles were collected, inspected, and placed into storage at various ordnance depots across Britain. Military planners in the 1920s focused on economy and standardization, saw no reason to maintain two rifle systems. The P14 was officially designated as SH reserve stock in 1926, essentially warehouse-bound, unless circumstances demanded its resurrection. Through the 1930s, these rifles sat in rack after rack in depots at Donington, Chilwell, and elsewhere, slowly accumulating dust and cosmoline. Young soldiers trained on Lee-Enfields and never saw a P14. Officers graduating from Sandhurst learned tactics around the standard-issue rifle. The Pattern 14 became what the Germans would later assume it was, a forgotten relic of the previous war. By 1939, when war clouds gathered again over Europe, the Pattern 14 had spent 2 decades in obscurity. Military budgets had focused on modernizing other equipment. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, rifles were rifles, and Britain had millions of perfectly functional Lee-Enfields. Nobody was thinking about precision shooting at extreme range. That would change. But first, an unexpected demonstration was needed, one that would come from snow-covered forests far to the north. Understanding why the Pattern 14 outperformed. Modern rifles requires examining the physics that govern precision shooting. The rifle's advantages weren't mystical, they were measurable, repeatable consequences of specific design choices. Start with the barrel. At 26 in, the P14's barrel was longer than the Lee-Enfield's 25 in. The German Kar98k's 23.6 in and substantially longer than most contemporary service rifles. That extra length mattered at extreme range because it gave the bullet more time to stabilize in the rifling before exiting. The 303 British cartridge achieved complete powder burn and maximum velocity in roughly 24 in of barrel, meaning the P14's extra length contributed primarily to stability rather than velocity, exactly what precision shooting demanded. The rifling itself told an equally important story. The P14 used a 1 in 10 in twist rate, meaning the bullet completed one full rotation every 10 in of barrel travel. This was slightly tighter than the Lee-Enfield's 1 in 10 variant, and importantly, it was cut with 5 grooves rather than the Lee-Enfield 6. Fewer, deeper grooves meant each land imparted more rotational energy with less deformation of the bullet. At ranges beyond 700 yards, where even minute bullet deformation affected trajectory, this mattered enormously. Testing at Busley ranges in the 1920s had demonstrated that P and 14 fired bullets showed more consistent flight characteristics than those from Lee-Enfields. Though at the time, nobody cared enough to act on the findings. The Mauser-type action contributed in ways that weren't immediately obvious. When a rifle fires, the entire system flexes and vibrates. The chamber pressure of a .303 round peaks at roughly 20 tons per square in the first millisecond after ignition. That enormous force has to be contained, and how it's contained affects accuracy. The P-14's action locked with 3 lugs at the front of the bolt, creating a rigid connection between bolt and receiver. The Lee-Enfield's rear locking lugs, whilst allowing faster operation, created more flex in the system. At short range, this flex was irrelevant. At 1,000 yards, where a millimetre of deviation at the muzzle translated to inches of drift at target, it became significant. Barrel harmonics, the way a barrel vibrates when fired, separate precision rifles from adequate ones. Every barrel whips in a consistent pattern when fired, and the bullet exits at a specific point in that whip cycle. The P-14's heavier barrel profile and more rigid bedding in the stock dampened these harmonics compared to lighter rifles. The German Kar98k, designed for general infantry use, prioritized weight savings over precision engineering. Its thinner barrel heated faster and whipped more pronouncedly. Soviet Mosin-Nagant rifles built for mass production had even less consistency in barrel harmonics. The P-14, originally designed when weight wasn't as critical a factor, possessed a barrel that maintained consistent harmonics shot after shot. Then there were the sights. The P-14's aperture rear sight, a small circular opening the shooter looked through, provided a fundamentally more precise sight picture than open notch sights. Human eyes naturally center objects within circular frames, making aperture sights inherently more accurate for target alignment. The front sight post appeared sharply defined through the aperture, and the target behind it came into clear focus simultaneously. Open notch sights like those on the Lee-Enfield and Kar98k required the eye to align 3 planes: rear notch, front post, and target, a task that introduced more potential for error. At close range, this difference was negligible. At extreme range, it determined whether a shot landed center mass or missed entirely. The P-14's sight radius, the distance between front and rear sights, measured 3 ft1 in longest of any standard infantry rifle of its era, further amplifying precision. The Winter War erupted on the 30th of November 1939 when Soviet forces invaded Finland. British military observers deployed to Finland to assess the conflict watched something remarkable unfold in the frozen forests. Finnish ski troops, vastly outnumbered, were systematically destroying Soviet units through precision marksmanship at ranges that defied conventional infantry doctrine. Snipers were achieving confirmed kills regularly beyond $600 minutes, with some engagements documented at 800 mil and beyond. The Finns used whatever rifles provided sufficient accuracy, primarily Mosin-Nagants with telescopic sights, but the tactical lesson was unmistakable. Modern warfare, at least in certain contexts, still demanded rifles capable of precision at extreme range. Major Neville Methen, a British Army observer attached to Finnish forces in January 1940, filed reports that caught attention at the War Office. He'd witnessed sniper operations that neutralized Soviet officers, machine gun crews, and artillery observers before they could effectively deploy. The kills weren't lucky shots, they were calculated professional marksmanship at distances where most soldiers couldn't identify targets, let alone engage them. Methuen noted that the Finns had adapted their entire defensive strategy around this long-range precision capability, using the terrain and their marksmanship to multiply their combat effectiveness tenfold. His report asked a pointed question. Could British forces achieve similar results, and if so, with what equipment? That question prompted someone at the War Office to remember the Pattern 14 rifles gathering dust in ordnance depots. In February 1940, whilst the Winter War still raged, a quiet requisition order went out. Selected P14s were pulled from storage at Donington and sent to High and Bisley for testing. The trials weren't extensive. Time didn't permit that, but they were revealing. When fitted with the number 32 3.5 power telescopic sight originally designed for the Lee-Enfield, the P14 produced groupings at 800 ydidi that exceeded expectations. More importantly, when the same tests were conducted with standard Lee-Enfields, the P14's superiority was undeniable and measurable. The timing proved fortuitous, if that word can apply to anything, in 1940. The Finnish-Soviet War demonstrated sniper effectiveness just as Britain faced the probability of fighting Germany. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized combined arms operations and mechanized warfare. But someone recognized that precision marksmen would still matter for eliminating officers, disrupting command structures, and creating psychological pressure beyond their numbers. The Pattern 14, written off as obsolete, suddenly represented a capability Britain possessed but wasn't using. The rifles existed in substantial numbers. The ammunition was standard .303 British, and the accuracy was proven. No development time, no factory retooling, no new supply chains, just recognition that old didn't mean useless. By late March 1940, when the Winter War ended with the Moscow Peace Treaty, British planning was already underway. The War Office issued instructions for Pattern 14 rifles to be inspected, refurbished if necessary, and prepared for reissue. Priority allocation lists were drafted. Commando units being formed for special operations went to the top of that list. The NAIANT sniper training programs, barely formalized at that stage, also received priority. By May 1940, as Germany launched its offensive through the Low Countries and France, the first refurbished P14s with telescopic sights were reaching specialized units. The soldiers receiving these rifles were often confused. They trained on Lee-Enfields, and here came 30-year-old rifles that looked and felt completely different. The bolt action was slower, the rifle heavier, the sight picture unfamiliar. But when they went to the ranges and fired at targets beyond 600 yd, confusion turned to appreciation. The Pattern 14 put rounds where they aimed with a consistency the Lee-Enfield couldn't match. For men being trained specifically for long-range precision work, the older rifle was demonstrably the better tool. Finland hadn't just provided tactical lessons. It had reminded Britain that weapons shouldn't be judged by age, but by capability. The British Army's sniper training infrastructure in 1940 was virtually non-existent. A few pre-war rifle clubs, some enthusiasts at Bisley, and scattered institutional knowledge from the Great War. That was the foundation upon which a modern sniper corps had to be built. The decision to standardize on the Pattern 14 forced trainers to develop doctrine specifically around the rifle's characteristics, rather than adapting existing methods. This constraint, initially viewed as a limitation, became an unexpected advantage. Everything was purpose-built for the P14 from the ground up. The number 32 telescopic sight married to the Pattern 14 created the standard British sniper combination. By late 1940, the scope offered 3.5 power magnification with a simple post reticle. Nothing fancy by later standards, but adequate for identifying and engaging man-sized targets at 800 yd. The mounting system attached to the rifle's left side, allowing the scope to sit low enough that the iron sights remained usable. This offset mounting required shooters to learn a slightly caned head position, which felt awkward initially, but became natural with practice. The number 32 wasn't adjustable for parallax, meaning the point of aim shifted slightly relative to the target at different ranges, a quirk that instructors had to teach students to compensate for instinctively. Training cadre at Bisley, Hythe and newly established schools like Landbearers in North Wales faced the challenge of teaching not just marksmanship, but ballistics. The P14 fired the standard 303 Mark 7 bullet, but its longer barrel and tighter rifling gave that bullet slightly different flight characteristics than when fired from a Lee-Enfield. Range cards had to be developed, showing the P14's specific trajectory. At 500 wide, the difference between rifles was measured in inches. At 1,000 y, it was measured in feet. Students learned to read the P-14's peculiar drop tables. The bullet fell 72 in at 600 YD, 180 in at 800 YD, and a dramatic 360 in at 1000 on wide. Windage calculation became almost a mathematical discipline. The instructors, many of them competitive target shooters pressed into service, taught students that a 10 mph crosswind would drift a 303 bullet approximately 8 in at 600 YD. That same wind at 800 YD caused 16 in of drift. Students learned to read mirage through their scopes, to watch grass and leaves for wind indicators, to mentally calculate lead times for moving targets. A man walking at normal pace covered roughly 4 ft per second. If he was 600 YD distant and moving perpendicular to the shot, the bullet would take roughly seconds to arrive, meaning the shooter had to aim nearly 4 ft ahead. The mathematics were relentless, and students who couldn't master them didn't graduate. Through 1941 and into 1942, the training program refined itself through iteration. Early courses lasted 4 weeks and produced adequate marksmen. By mid-1942, courses extended to 6 weeks and produced snipers who understood their weapon system intimately. They learned the P-14's trigger, heavier than the Lee-Enfield's, at roughly 6 pounds of pull weight, requiring smooth, steady pressure rather than a quick snap. They learned the rifle's recoil characteristics, sharper than the Lee-Enfield due to the more rigid action, demanding better shoulder weld and follow-through. They learned to estimate range without aids, to account for temperature effects on barrel steel and ammunition performance, to maintain zero even as the rifle absorbed the inevitable knocks of field service. The Pattern 14 demanded more from its users than the Lee-Field, but it also rewarded competence with performance no other British rifle could match. The soldiers emerging from sniper schools weren't carrying museum pieces. They were carrying precision instruments that in skilled hands could reach across 1,000 yards and change tactical situations. The hedge of Normandy after the 6th of June 1944 created a sniper's paradise and an infantryman's nightmare. The ancient field boundaries, thick earthen banks crowned with dense vegetation, divided the landscape into hundreds of small compartments, each offering concealment and killing zones rarely exceeding 300 yards. Yet even here, the Pattern 14's range advantage mattered. British sniper sections attached to infantry battalions used the P-14's precision to dominate German movement in ways that altered tactical calculus. Sergeant William Fulton of the South Lancashire Regiment recorded typical employment in his unit diary during July operations near KH. His 2-man sniper team would position themselves in the upper floor of a damaged farmhouse or church tower, locations that offered extended sight lines across multiple hedgerow compartments. From these positions, they could observe German positions at ranges between 500 and 800 YD, too distant for effective rifle fire from standard infantry weapons, but well within the P-14's capability, Fulton noted, neutralizing a German machine gun crew at approximately 650 yards on the 14th of July. The MG-42 team had been suppressing British infantry attempting to advance through an orchard. Fulton's first round struck the gunner. His second hit the assistant gunner, reaching for the weapon, and the surviving crew abandoned the position. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 20 seconds, and the British infantry advanced without further opposition from that strong point. This pattern repeated across multiple divisions throughout the Normandy campaign. German officers quickly learned that showing themselves at ranges they considered safe often proved fatal. A Hamann commanding a company near Villers-Bouage in late June made the mistake of using binoculars to observe British positions from what he judged was 600 men's distance, safe from accurate rifle fire by normal standards. A British sniper with a P-14 put a round through his chest at an estimated 680 yard. The German company spent the rest of the day leaderless and disorganized, failing to counterattack when opportunity existed. The tactical value wasn't just one dead officer. It was an entire unit rendered combat ineffective during critical hours. German sniper teams equipped with Kar-98k rifles found themselves at a distinct disadvantage. The Kar-98k was perfectly adequate for engagements under $500 enter, but British snipers with P-14s could engage from ranges where German return fire was essentially speculative. Wehrmacht after-action reports from Normandy repeatedly noted that British snipers seemed to operate with impunity at extended ranges. German snipers attempting to suppress British marksmen found themselves outranged and forced to relocate constantly, reducing their effectiveness. The psychological impact compounded the tactical one. German soldiers became reluctant to move in daylight when British snipers were active, slowing response times and degrading unit cohesion. As operations progressed through France and into the Low Countries during autumn 1944, British sniper doctrine matured around the P-14's capabilities. Sniper sections were increasingly tasked with counter-battery work against German mortars and machine gun positions rather than simple target of opportunity shooting. The long-range precision allowed snipers to eliminate weapon crews from positions where the weapons themselves couldn't effectively respond. During Operation Market Garden in September, British snipers supporting the ground advance into the Netherlands regularly engaged German positions across the wide Dutch rivers at ranges exceeding 700 yards, suppressing enemy fire during bridge approaches. The Rhine crossing operations in March 1945 showcased the P-14's utility in its purest form. British sniper teams positioned on the western bank could observe and engage German positions on the eastern bank at ranges up to 900 YD. Before assault troops crossed, snipers systematically eliminated German observers, machine gun crews, and any personnel who exposed themselves. The crossings still faced fierce resistance, but German defensive coordination was severely degraded by the methodical elimination of key personnel before the assault even began. Wehrmacht ordnance officers had collected captured British weapons throughout the war as standard practice, but Pattern 14 rifles didn't receive serious attention until mid-1944, the prevailing assumption that the P-14 was obsolete equipment. Britain used from necessity meant captured. Examples typically went into storage rather than analysis. That changed when field reports from Normandy began describing British sniper effectiveness that German intelligence couldn't readily explain. Someone at Heeresreferenamt, the German Army Weapons Agency, decided the old British rifle warranted proper examination. In August 1944, several captured P-14 rifles with number 32 scopes arrived at the Kummersdorf proving grounds south of Berlin, Germany's primary weapons testing facility. The technical staff approached the evaluation with barely concealed skepticism. These were rifles designed before the Great War, manufactured in American factories 3 decades prior, chambered for a cartridge the Germans considered inferior to their own 7.92 mm Mauser. The expectation was that testing would quickly identify why British troops clung to obsolete equipment, probably manufacturing shortcuts due to wartime industrial capacity or perhaps desperate shortages of Lee-Enfields. The test protocols were standard accuracy measurements at graduated distances from $100 to $1,000 m, mechanical function testing, metallurgical analysis of barrel steel, examination of rifling quality and manufacturing tolerances. The first surprise came during barrel inspection. The P-14's bore showed remarkably consistent rifling. The groove depth varied less than 0.02 mm throughout the barrel length, indicating manufacturing precision that matched or exceeded current German production standards. The barrel steel composition, when analyzed, proved to be high-quality chrome molybdenum alloy, properly heat-treated. This wasn't expedient wartime manufacturing. It was precision work. The accuracy testing delivered results that the ordnance team initially suspected were measurement errors. At 500 mm, the P-14 consistently produced groupings of approximately 12 Skennerton, roughly 4.7 in. The standard Kar98k, tested under identical conditions, produced groups averaging 16 to 18 cm. At 800 mm, the difference became more pronounced. The P-14 maintained groupings under 30 cm, whilst the Kar98k spread to 45 cm or more. At $1,000 mem a range the Germans considered theoretical for service rifles, the P-14 was landing shots in a pattern roughly 60 centimeters across. The Kar-98k's groupings at that distance were nearly double that size, and some rounds were keyholing, indicating marginal stability. The technical report dated the 17th of September 1944 reached conclusions that contradicted decades of German assumptions. The Pattern 14 wasn't obsolete through poor performance. It had been superseded for reasons unrelated to accuracy. Its fundamental design characteristics, the longer barrel, the rigid action, the superior sight system delivered precision that German service rifles couldn't match. More troubling, the report noted that these advantages weren't achieved through advanced materials or manufacturing techniques unavailable to Germany. They resulted from design choices made in 1913 that prioritized accuracy over rate of fire and weight. The German response came too late to matter. In October 1944, Mauser received instructions to develop improved sight systems for the Kar-98k and to investigate barrel specification changes that might improve long-range accuracy. The engineering work proceeded through that autumn, but by then, Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under Allied bombing. Prototype improvements were tested in December, showing modest accuracy gains, but implementing them across production lines was impossible. The facilities were struggling to maintain existing output, let alone retool for modifications. Some enhanced Kar-98k variants with improved aperture sights were produced in small numbers in early 1945, but fewer than 2,000 left the factories before the war ended. What stung German ordnance officers most wasn't that the British had a superior sniper rifle. It was that they'd possessed it since 1915 and had simply chosen not to use it for decades. Germany had spent the war assuming British equipment inferiority whilst being systematically outshot by rifles older than many of the soldiers carrying them. The war's end brought the usual flood of after-action reports, technical assessments, and lessons learned documents that military bureaucracies generate when fighting stops. Amongst these, buried in procurement reviews and small arms performance studies, was a quiet acknowledgement that fundamentally challenged conventional thinking about weapons development. The Pattern 14, dismissed as obsolete for 2 decades, had outperformed every contemporary rifle in the specific role of long-range precision shooting. This wasn't a minor statistical anomaly. It represented a measurable, repeatable superiority that had tactical consequences throughout the war. British post-war small arms development couldn't ignore these findings when designers at the Royal Small Arms Factory began work on the EM2 rifle in 1947, intended to replace both the Lee-Enfield and the P-14. They incorporated lessons learned from the older rifle's unexpected success. The EM2 featured a relatively long barrel for its overall length, achieved through bullpup configuration, and emphasized accuracy over rate of fire in its design parameters. The aperture sight system, which had proven so effective on the P-14, became standard on the EM2. The project eventually fell victim to NATO standardization politics, but the design philosophy reflected recognition that precision mattered more than the British Army had previously acknowledged. American ordnance officers drew similar conclusions. The U.S. rifle model of 1917, essentially the P-14 rechambered 4306, had served American forces in both world wars with distinction. When the U.S. Army began developing what became the M14 rifle in the 1950s, design parameters explicitly called for accuracy at extended range as a primary requirement. The M14's longer barrel, aperture sights, and emphasis on precision reflected lessons that traced directly back to the Pattern 14's combat performance. The rifle that American factories had manufactured as a British emergency measure in 1915 had influenced American small arms philosophy 40 years later. The broader lesson extended beyond specific rifle designs to fundamental questions about military procurement. The Pattern 14 proved that superior manufacturing tolerances and sound engineering principles didn't age the way electronics or engines did. A rifle barrel with precise rifling, proper metallurgy, and correct dimensional specifications performed as well in 1944 as it had in 1914. The physics governing bullet flight hadn't changed. The principles of barrel harmonics, sight radius, and action rigidity remained constant. Modern materials and manufacturing techniques could improve rifles, but they couldn't overcome poor fundamental design through novelty alone. This recognition influenced how military organizations evaluated existing equipment versus new development. Not everything old required replacement simply because newer options existed. Sometimes decades-old designs, if properly maintained, delivered capabilities that newer equipment couldn't match in specific roles. The Pattern 14 had been functionally superior to the Kar98k for precision shooting, despite being older, heavier and slower to operate because its core design prioritized the factors that mattered for that specific task. The Pattern 14 rifles themselves largely disappeared after 1945. Most were either scrapped, sold as surplus to various Commonwealth nations, or converted to sporting rifles. A few remained in British armories through the 1950s, used primarily for training and ceremonial purposes. By the 1960s, they'd vanished from active service entirely. Yet, their influence persisted in the design philosophies they'd validated and the assumptions they'd overturned. The rifle born from pre-war panic, manufactured in a foreign country, rejected by the army it was designed for, and resurrected from storage by desperation, had proven something important. In warfare, as in most endeavors, fundamental quality and sound engineering principles matter more than novelty or age. A 30-year-old rifle had outshot modern weapons because its designers had understood and properly addressed the physics of precision shooting. That lesson, learned in Hedros and across rivers from Normandy to the Rhine, influenced rifle development for generations. The Pattern 14's greatest legacy wasn't the battles it won. It was the reminder that good design doesn't expire.